So I was watching instead of reading the manga, which was admittedly a dumb decision after being advised explicitly to read the manga instead. But after watching it, I was left with a lot of confusion as to why I disliked the second season of the anime compared to the first. But then I realized it's because of a problem that's very apparent from the beginning of the season, something that rearranged the entire context of the story and made it feel very rushed, and by the end it just leaves you feeling unsatisfied. It felt like paying for tickets to attend a basketball game, sitting down in anticipation to watch it, only to watch the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes of the game somehow. You have no idea how the game got to where it is, and you're just left feeling confused. This is what happens when you use a time skip incorrectly. So then the question remains, how do you properly write a time skip into your story? Well, in today's video, I'm going to give you some examples across different forms of media to give you an idea of how to make a good time skip versus how to write a bad one. Most narrative devices can be mostly seen as a good thing as long as you write them into your story in a way that makes sense, that only adds to your narrative instead of making it worse. You don't have to be particularly original to make a good story either. Almost everything has been done at a certain point, so if you want to write your own story, it's important that you recognize and acknowledge that it's okay to borrow things from influences that inspire you to be creative. Every amazing piece of media was inspired by something. As long as you write something that takes the elements of your influences and you put your own spin on it to make it your own, it's okay to borrow certain aspects from other stories, as long as it's well written. That's the most important part of this. Anyways, let me not get ahead of myself anymore. Let's take the first and maybe most recent popular example of a time skip I could think of and explore how using a time skip in this narrative changed the overall experience. Spoiler warning for
whatever it takes.
But at the same time, like, do I really need a spoiler warning for Avengers Endgame? Like, if you haven't seen it at this point, then either you're not interested in the series as a whole, or you don't really care regardless. But I'm still going to put up a spoiler warning anyways, because I don't know, some people are kind of stupid and, you know, it's like, oh, but I haven't seen it yet, even though it's been like over 2 years. You get it. Amidst all the head chopping, taco crushing, dimension hopping, finger snapping, tear jerking madness, there is a narrative here. A narrative where our heroes, for the first time in their entire career, have to accept defeat. And not just any defeat either. They have to accept the losses that came with the defeat. Half the population of the entire universe level defeat. And that defeat included the loss of many loved ones our heroes cared about deeply. That pill couldn't have been an easy pill to swallow, and so the movie starts off just 5 years after Infinity War. This time skip right here serves a very specific purpose in the story that, in my opinion, wasn't really talked about enough. Everyone grieves their losses in different ways, some healthier than others, but we get to sit down with each of our characters for a brief moment, and we get to see how our heroes dealt with not only the loss of their friends, but the loss of their family. And it goes just beyond losing people too. In the final battle of Infinity War, our heroes are so close to defeating Thanos, and Thor fails to land the final blow on him, and he says the iconic line,
You should have gone for the head.
And this moment right here sits with Thor. You can tell that he's been mentally wrestling with that mistake. And when he sees Thanos and realizes that all the stones have been destroyed, there is zero hesitation in his movement. And all the Avengers were hostile with Thanos, but nobody was more hostile than Thor, who wants nothing more than a chance to undo his mistake.
Now I know that guy might scare you.
Why would I be? Why would I be scared of that guy? I'm the one who killed that guy, remember? Anyone else here killed that guy? Nope. Didn't think so.
Unable to undo his past mistakes, he declines mentally, losing all sense of pride and self-worth, which is most obvious by his weight gain and playing Fortnite. This is still a real thing. Oh my gosh. Regardless of how silly the thought of Thanos, the God of Thunder, playing Fortnite to cope with his loss is, editor Deventerous here I just realized that I said Thanos the God of Thunder instead of saying Thor the God of Thunder. Ha ha ha. Laugh it up. It's so funny. Please tell me how much of a clown I am in the comments. Him and the rest of the characters all undergo evolutions that are natural progressions of their story arcs that sadly aren't explored as much as some of us would have liked, but regardless, I still think this time skip is a pretty good example of how using this narrative device can enhance your story and service the characters in a way that isn't forced or feels unnatural. The reason this time skip is effective in this narrative is because it does the same thing every good time skip does in a story. It gives you a direct contrast of how we saw the characters previously to how they are now, and that can provide intrigue to the viewer that will make them want to watch your story unfold because now they want to know why the characters have become the way they are. And when a time skip is done correctly, it can give you new insight on a character that you hadn't seen before, because a time skip puts the story in a very specific situation that we as the audience most likely hadn't seen before either, so you see a new side of them as a result of this. This time skip showed us that underneath all the remarkable superpowers and abilities, superheroes still have one main weakness that you can't take away: the people they care about. No superpower can take away the emotional pain of losing someone you love, and this time skip does a great job of showing us a more down-to-earth human side of the Avengers that we only get to see a small glimpse of in the other movies. But enough about Avengers for now. Let's give another example that's a little more video game related. It's this small indie game I'm sure you guys have never heard of. It's this little game called Do I even need to give a spoiler warning for Ocarina of Time? The game is 23 years old. Ocarina of Time perfectly manages to capture the innocence of childhood in its first few hours. The very first playable moment in the game is Link waking up in his house, and the music gives off a very joyful yet playful atmosphere that accentuates the entire gameplay experience in those first few hours. Outside of the dungeons, the gameplay mostly revolves around Link walking around in Kakariko Village, helping the townspeople, making friends, playing games. Link doesn't have any real responsibilities, and there's a jovial sense of freedom in that. There's almost a nostalgic vibe to this part of the game that takes you back to the carefree nature of childhood that is rarely captured in modern video games anymore. When you meet Zelda, the game frames the adventure you're about to embark on as something cute and fun to stop the evil Ganondorf from taking over the land of Hyrule. But that's all it is to Zelda and Link. A fun game. There's no way there can be actual consequences to this. These are the consequences that Link now has to face thanks to the game that they were playing as kids, and 7 years later, Link is now an adult that has to suffer the consequences of the decisions he made when he was younger, something I'm sure we're all familiar with at some point in our lives. Thanks to the game that him and Zelda were playing, because they didn't take stopping Ganondorf seriously, the world they knew has now been completely destroyed, a dark, desperate, and desolate shell of what Hyrule once was. This contrast between how Hyrule was when you were a kid versus now when you're older is so potent, not only from a story perspective, but also for gameplay reasons as well. For the most part, the combat and dungeons are pretty easy in the child section of the game. It's very straightforward and not really anything you have to think too hard about to progress. There's no real weight to anything Link does in this early part of the game. By comparison, the combat becomes significantly more difficult, the puzzle is much more complex, and the social and moral situations you're faced with are much harder to navigate than they once were. A world that seemingly was black and white has suddenly turned gray, and this shift in gameplay does such a wonderful job of showing us the difference between adult life and the carefree nature of childhood. When you're young, you have no responsibilities, no weight on your shoulders, and when you become an adult, you feel as if your responsibilities have suddenly become never-ending. Now fast forward 7 years, and the place that Link called home, the place that provided a sense of safety, joy, and innocence, are now barren wastelands thanks to the rule of Ganondorf. But Link was a kid, he didn't understand the full consequences of his actions, and now adult Link has to pick up the pieces if he ever wants his home to look the way it once was. Places that Link cherished that were once lavish with love and life is now a broken home to those who once lived there with only the happy memories of what once was to comfort you in this lonely time. Link has to grow up and shoulder the responsibility of helping the people who've now been affected by his actions and learn what it means to become a hero. Now imagine if this story didn't have a time skip. Would this narrative be as strong as it is without the time skip? I'm gonna go ahead and say probably not. Ocarina of Time basically hits all the checkpoints in effectively writing a time skip into your story that makes your story better instead of making it worse. This time skip was effectively used by showing a sharp contrast by making the consequences of Link's childhood extremely dark and depressing. All this to say, both Nintendo and Marvel did a pretty good job at showing how to properly use a time skip in a way that only few writers have managed. It's not an easy task. You have to take into consideration many factors of your story. How will this time skip affect our characters? Why do they undergo the changes they go through? How does the character changing affect the people around them and thus the world around them? But when it's done right, it can be one of the most powerful narrative devices in storytelling, and for the examples that get it right, they should be appreciated a lot more for managing to make a good story out of it. And by the way, if you want a bad example on how to do a time skip, just watch Season 2 of Promised Neverland. Or don't. Just read the manga. Don't be like me. Do yourself a favor. Don't watch Season 2 of Promised Neverland. Please.